Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lebogang Manjane. I'm the Executive Director of Evisas, which is the Independent Schools Association of Southern Africa, which is the largest and oldest school association in the region. It really gives me tremendous pleasure this afternoon to be able to be introducing Ann Bernstein to you. I've known Ann since 2004. I myself am a graduate of Bristol University with my LLB in 1999. And so when the alumni office said, could you please introduce Ann this afternoon? I was like, well, what a tremendous pleasure, because Ann has been a colleague of mine for quite a long time. And I have deep admiration for the important work that she does, and she never stops, and she's always working and making significant contributions to policy formation in our country. So Ann is the founder and executive director of the Center for Development and Enterprise, South Africa's leading development think tank, which focuses on inclusive economic growth and democratic consolidation. Ann has published numerous reports and op-eds in topics, including economic growth, jobs, education, skills, land reform, urbanization, cities, and the role of business. She engages regularly with leaders in government, business, civil society, and academia. She's a frequent commentator in the media, and her book, The Case for Business in Developing Economics, published by Penguin in 2010, received favorable reviews in South Africa media. The Economist, Financial Times, Forbes, and won the Sir Anthony Fisher Award in 2012 from the Atlas Research Foundation in Washington, D.C. She has participated in many seminal development initiatives in South Africa and internationally. She's been a member of the transition team, then joined the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa between 1994 and 2001. She was a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, also in Washington, D.C. in 2005, and was a member of the Brenters Foundation board for a decade that spanned from 2007 to 2017. She's been invited member of the World Economic Forum in Davos in both 2008, and 2009. She's a public policy scholar, she was a public policy scholar, at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. in 2013, and was an invited fellow at the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio in 2016. She received the University of Johannesburg's Ellen Kuzwa Award in 2019. So I'm really pleased and honored to now hand over the forum to Ann and the mic. And I know that she's going to deliver a thought-provoking talk to us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lebogang. Just before you hand over to Ann, just some housekeeping. Can we just post any questions to Ann in the Q&A and keep any chats into the chat function? So I just want to keep the chat and Q&A separate. So any questions, direct ones you'd like to ask of Ann, put in the Q&A. Thank you very much, and over to you, Ann.
Well, thanks very much, and for that lengthy introduction. I appreciate it, Lebogang. It's great to be at WITS today. I'm proud to be a graduate of this university and all that it's achieved and does achieve today. I run an unusual organization, the Center for Development and Enterprise. It's a policy think tank that has been described as a national resource paid for by philanthropists and business. And our job is to think hard about national challenges, to help South Africa be a successful democracy and to make it a much more inclusive society, a much more developed society where millions and millions of South Africa get the benefits that I and many other people have had and take for granted. We try and influence government and business and media and civil society on how to think about key challenges and what to do about them. We've also brought many international experts to this country from whom we have learned a great deal, and we try and get them into the South African debate in the most constructive way possible. Now, in addition to having mountains of research and many, many publications and a very active website, we have a chairman who likes us to reduce years of analysis and work to pithy sound bites or T-shirt slogans. And we have a few of those that give you a sense of the kinds of issues we deal with and some of our thinking. So let me just throw a few T-shirts at you. South Africa needs jobs for the workforce we actually have and not the skilled workforce we wish we had. This country spends too much time making the top of our society blacker and far too little time on making the bottom of our society better. We tend to compensate the poor for their exclusion rather than working very hard for their inclusion. And an unskilled low-wage job is a lot better as a first step than no job at all. And then my last one, which has become part of the lexicon in certain circles, you cannot be anti-business and expect to grow our economy or deal with poverty. So my talk today, I'm going to talk about where the country's at now. I'm going to talk about the president's recovery plan. Is this a credible step to building momentum for what we need to do? I'm going to ask if we can get there from here and then pull this together with some concluding remarks. So let's start with where is the South Africa today? We have an escalating economic, fiscal, jobs, and social crisis, all of which have been exacerbated by poor decision-making and implementation. We have a cabinet where different ministries approach South Africa's challenges in different ways. The Minister of Finance wants to cut expenditure. The Minister of Public Enterprises wants to fund SAA. The Minister of Social Development wants a basic income grant for every single adult. We have state capacity today that is demonstrably weak and riddled with corruption. And there's been no significant progress on the reform agenda. In fact, this government, nearly 3 years old, has a growing credibility gap. And then it might sound surprising, but it's my view that there's insufficient sense of urgency to get moving, to get South Africa out of the terrible situation that we're in. So I'm afraid I see a country at drift, desperate for bold leadership, direction, and action. Now, we've spent a lot of time over the last 6 months pulling together and thinking about where the country's at and reading all the different recovery strategies, a mountain of them. And here are our key insights and conclusions. For South Africa to move forward, we have to recognize what has got the country into the terrible mess that we're in. Why are we here? It's not just COVID and the lockdown, but it's 12 years, probably more, of misrule by the government. It's not just the Guptas and state capture, but it's bad policy decisions on almost every front. We have an approach to markets, to investment, to business that has led to economic decline and a junk status rating. We have an approach to empowerment on that absolutely vital issue of inclusion, where our approach has increased inequality, it has fostered corruption, and it's undermined ethics across the board. Our state is now all but crippled. There are some pockets of excellence, but very few. So the state is weak, almost broken, and also very expensive. So I'm going to argue today that real honesty is required about what has gone wrong and why. And it's only that will provide an essential foundation to then start to build a bridge out of disaster. Now, over the last few months, it sometimes felt as though the only growth industry in the country was the delivery of recovery strategies. Almost everybody has his own plan of what we should do. Now, most people want to look for the similarities. They want desperately to find a common view on how to get South Africa out of its trouble. But these similarities are often more superficial than real. Does everyone, for example, mean the same thing when they suggest localization? Well, 10 days ago, the president released his plan for reconstruction and recovery. And of course, this is the most important one. So this is the one I'm going to concentrate on now. Will these proposals achieve faster and more inclusive growth? So for those of you who might have read in the paper or seen a quick summary of what the president said, I'm afraid to really understand what is on the table, you have to read the president's speech, his initial speech, the actual plan document, the implementation plan, the highlights from the plan, and the employment stimulus document. So this is quite a body of material I'm going to very quickly give you a feel of. The key elements of the plan are this concept of industrialization through localization, an infrastructure push, energy push, something called reforms for growth, and an employment stimulus. I'll take you through some of these rather quickly. Unfortunately, the first place I have to start is with the contradictions, because they're important. The plan says we want to cut red tape. But if you read the document, there are subordinate goals for every program, especially set-asides in procurement processes, which will increase red tape enormously. So for example, the infrastructure program will privilege local industries to strengthen the empowerment of women, young people, persons with disability, and military veterans. And then I'm afraid the core proposals rather happily envisage an increase in the costs of doing business in South Africa. You might recall that the president, February 2019, said that he wanted South Africa to improve 50 places in terms of the World Bank's Doing Business Index, where they measure these things. Rather imperfectly, but it's a measure. Now here we have this plan say that we're going to increase the cost of doing business in order to increase localization. This will undermine competitiveness and the productivity of our economy. Now, what is this industrialization through localization? Some of you will have noticed that through the pandemic, there's been talk in many places overseas, in many countries, about how countries prepare themselves for a future pandemic, and that you might need to localize production so we're not all dependent on a supply chain to China. A reasonable proposition. But this has morphed in the government's plan into something very different. They're arguing that localization will be driven aggressively in sectors related to infrastructure delivery, but also in every other industry. And there's a long list of all the other industries where we're going to enforce localization, local production of goods and services. What about the big infrastructure push? Everyone seems to be in favor of this as though it's motherhood. And who could be opposed to it? We all want better roads, bridges, all sorts of things. But the question is, does the infrastructure investment drive that at the heart of this plan make sense? And is it a growth strategy? Well, it's possible, but it's certainly not a silver bullet. Everything is going to depend on building the right infrastructure that supports growth and pays for itself at the right price so that the ability to pay for itself is increased. And so we don't need to increase taxes or user charges. Think of the e-tolls. And thirdly, that we manage this infrastructure, that we have resources to maintain it. This is not clear in the plan at all. I'm not going to go into the energy component of this. There was nothing new announced in the plan. The minister has been announcing certain things. And I suppose 2 points here. It would take too long to get into all the detail, but the one message is just get on with it already. Let's move much, much faster. And to illustrate that, think of the cost of delay. In February 2019, a special task team appointed by the president gave him a report on what to do about Eskom. At that stage, Eskom's debt was 450 billion rand. Today, October 2020, that debt is heading for 500 billion rand. So delay has enormous costs, and we need to get a lot better at fixing our energy supply, but this plan doesn't announce anything new. A key component of the plan is what's called reforms for growth. Now, this consists of a long list of actions, which are the same old list we've been seeing actually since 2018, 2019, February 2020. Let me give you a few examples. So spectrum, this auctioning off of spectrum so that we can get cheaper data costs, move to 5G, all sorts of things. In February 2018, the president committed to getting it done. Well, now the deadline has moved out to March 2021. What about e-visas? Who could be opposed to e-visas? Many countries much poorer than South Africa, Ethiopia, for example, have an excellent e-visa system. Well, February 2019, we were told that this was the highest priority of the president for the year, to establish a world-class e-visa regime. Here we are, October 2020, and the plan says efforts will be focused now on putting in place an efficient e-visa program. So that's the old list, if you like, a whole lot of things, most of which I certainly would support and would want it to have been done yesterday. But you do have to ask if this old list, now part of the new plan, is sufficient. What's missing here? Well, labor reforms were part of the National Treasury's reform document, August 2019. They moved off very quickly, and now they're nowhere in sight. We then have a personal bugbear of mine, which is the famous critical list is going to be produced. This is a list of skills South Africa needs, and we will allow foreign skilled people to come in to perform these jobs. Firstly, this is a crazy way to think about a modern economy where most people get a degree and end up doing something completely different in the economy. It's a very narrow approach to deal with pressure from big business to bring in the skills they need, which we desperately need, even when the economy is stagnating. But what South Africa really needs is to open the door to skilled immigrants. We're desperately short of skilled people. And as much as we should be fixing our basic education system and our vocational education system, we don't have enough skilled people, even at 0.1% growth. But we never get around to having that conversation. There are some new reforms on the plans list, most of which are good ones. There's all the energy stuff. There's fixing our procurement framework, which is vital and is essential to get the infrastructure investment by the private sector going, but there's no timeline for this. There's a commitment to a 50% reduction in the mining license regime. In other words, the amount of time that it takes, no timeline here. And then there's some interesting new words. I don't know exactly what they mean, that there will be private access to the rail network in terms of, who knows, provision or management's not clear, and the same private participation in our ports. We desperately need this as our ports are not globally competitive. They're at the other end of the spectrum, and we don't have enough port capacity for exports. But this is like a wish list. It's not really a plan. The one thing that's very important that is missing is a commitment to do something about the major state-owned companies, which are draining the fiscus, do not deliver the services we need, and when they do, they're very expensive. They're all going to need a post-COVID bailout, but there's no word about what's going to happen in terms of the state-owned companies. So you have to end reading this long list by asking yourself, well, how serious is this? How fast will it all happen? And have the political battles been joined to make this happen? The answer is, who knows? Now, the last part of, it's not really part of the plan, but it was released at the same time, and it's very important, the whole issue of employment. CDE has done an enormous amount of work on South Africa's unemployment challenge, which just keeps growing and growing. So irrespective of the amount of talk by presidents, job summits, presidential initiatives, projects by the private sector, irrespective of everything, the amount of unemployed people pre-COVID was well over 10 million, and it just keeps getting worse. If you're a young person, aged 15 to 24, your cohort is over 70% unemployed. If you're aged 15 to 34, you're over 50% unemployed. Globally, something like 62% of the workforce is generally employed. South Africa pre-COVID was at 42%, a complete global outlier. And we know that during COVID, anywhere between 2 to 3 million people lost their jobs. So we're heading towards 13 million, which means about 60% of our workforce is not working. They're eager to work, but there are no jobs. So what is the president's response to this in a very difficult situation? He is proposing state-created and state-funded jobs, about 800,000 short-term part-time work opportunities he's committing to have up and running before the end of the financial year in February 2021. There's some big issues here. I'll just raise one. Will these people be paid the national minimum wage, or will they be paid what the many people on our public works programs are paid, which is a lot less? It has a big impact in terms of the amount of money we're going to spend. We might find out this afternoon. But the big question I want to ask, I'm not opposed to expanding public works at this terrible time, but you know, we can't fund lots and millions of people. we're going to have to grow the economy. And so the big question is, why is the president only coming with the state-dominated response? How does this change South Africa's bias as an economy to capital-intensive projects? And how does it help us move towards a more labor-intensive kind of economy, which we desperately need? The last point I want to make is to talk about implementation, and I'm going to share one slide because it's the quickest way of doing this. So, how are we going to implement everything in the plan? I started going through all the documents and writing it down because I thought, what's wrong with me? I don't understand this. When I got to page 3, I realized it wasn't me. So the way that the president and the plan are going to implement all of this is part 1 in national government. We're going to have ministers and departments who cost us a lot of money, let us remember. We're going to have a presidential advisory technical team and the National Treasury's Operation Vulindlela to push reforms, might be a good idea. The economic cluster of ministers get together in meetings. Then there's going to be a National Economic Recovery Council, and somehow this will all end up at the National Command Council. This will all be duplicated in the provinces, you'll be pleased to know. And then, in a way I don't fully understand and no one has been able to explain to me, at the same time, the NEDLAC institution, where the social partners, big business, big government and labor, some labor have got together with and developed their own recovery plan and their own social compact for energy. They will be implementing this, and this will be monitored by an additional presidential working committee supported by a leadership team and numerous working groups. And ultimately, this ends up at the National Command Council. Well, you have to ask yourselves, is this really plausible? So, I have some questions about implementation. The first and most important, maybe, is what happened to the private sector here? I thought they were going to play a much bigger role. That's what we were promised. That's what the rhetoric says. There are obvious underperformers in cabinet, but there are never any consequences for them. The key issue for the past 3 years of the Ramaphosa presidency has been policy paralysis. How does all this help resolve that? So I'm left thinking maybe somebody else understands this, but I want to know who takes accountability for what? Who will be fired if implementation does not happen? So let me move, that's the plan, very briefly summarized, but some essential points. You have to ask yourselves some questions. Is this a credible plan? Both the content and the implementation. Now, it's important to say that reform is a process. You don't have to solve everything at once, but you have to pick the right first steps to build momentum. Does this plan solve the state capacity problem? I've been going around South Africa for the last, zooming around South Africa for the last few months, saying that if the state is broken, we need to work out how to fix it. What are the principles, merit, and a few other things that we need? But then what are we going to do tomorrow to implement the reforms that we need when we don't have the state that we need? Does this plan deal with that? So I suppose those are the big questions you need to ask about this plan. I do have my views on what I was looking for from the president. I'd be happy to deal with that in the Q&A if anybody's interested. Let me now pull this together. I think South Africa has all the potential to be a great African lion of an economy. But we keep disappointing, and we're now in a deep cycle of decline. In my view, we cannot make progress if we continue along the same lines. We have to rethink the attitudes, the policies that have brought the country to this sorry state. Tweaking, fiddling on the edges, avoiding the big issues will not do the job, as the past nearly 3 years have shown us. It is true that our state, as I keep emphasizing, is weak and corrupt and ineffective. But we do have capacity in South Africa. We have a private sector that is strong, certainly not perfect, but is strong. That could be even more impressive if it were not restrained and held back by policymakers' unjustified belief in the merits of a commandist, disciplining, developmental state. The state can be fixed and it must be fixed, but this will take time. In the meanwhile, in almost every sector of our society and our economy, the private sector, not just big companies, medium-sized, small companies, individual entrepreneurs, if we freed them up, there's a lot more that they can be doing if we supported them rather than imposed regulation after regulation after regulation to make sure they do what the bureaucrats want them to do. You can see this in terms of energy supply, where both the mines and big companies have been offering additional energy to put on the grid for a long time. You can see this with land reform, a vital issue in our society, where the commercial agriculture, the mines and others have been offering land, training, and opportunity for new Black farmers. In my view, there will be no recovery if government's ambiguity and anti-business attitudes and policies persist. The government-business relationship has to change fundamentally, and we need a state that seeks to enable business growth, not one that sees itself as being responsible for what you might call disciplining capital, or continually expanding the role of the state in the economy when it has no capacity. You'll be pleased to know the plan includes provision for a state bank. So let me end. The country needs leadership, not endless processes that never seem to get beyond fiddling or tweaking. I am opposed to the prevailing view that compacting will solve everything. You can use compacting to bring people together, to find a common road. But without leadership and a new vision for South Africa, we're not going to get anywhere. The country is in deep trouble. I think the president has to put the national interest above party unity and electioneering. He has to build the political coalitions necessary for South Africa to start doing things differently. And that is what's missing at the moment. I do believe the country can be turned around. To do that, we need much greater seriousness and honesty about where we are today, how bad things are today, and a much more strategic and much more speedy approach to how we can move forward. Thank you very much. I'll end there. I believe I'm in charge of the Q&A. So let me see. Okay. Well, the first question, I'm pleased you've raised this, Mamelo, about skilled graduates. Let me deal with that. We've done a lot of work on this, and there's a lot of talk about this. So remember, South Africa's been in stagnation, economic stagnation since about 2015. So in a declining or stagnant economy, you don't get additional jobs for new people, new graduates coming onto the workforce. That's just the reality of it. Pre-2015, when we were growing modestly, very modestly, the truth is that if you had a degree from a university, you were not unemployed. You might not get the job you want. You might not get it as fast as you want, but graduates were not unemployed. We're desperately short of graduates. If you didn't finish, or you went to a technicon or a technical university, or if you didn't have a tertiary qualification, then the numbers of unemployed people get much bigger. So yes, I'm sure today under COVID, there are unemployed graduates. And that's why I'm so much in favor of the bold steps that are needed for much faster growth. A second question is about labor reforms. The question says, tell us more about labor reforms that are now off the reform list from Treasury and from the President's plan. Well, these reforms, which I support 100%, were supposed to move to NEDLAC for negotiation, and then that hasn't happened. That was what happened to the reforms. Look, at the end of the day, we're in a very difficult situation. We have this massive unemployment problem, all these millions of people pushing at the door who would work for almost any wage they can get. And then we have trade unions who, after decades of struggle, have achieved important changes to our legislation and protections and standards in the labor force. And we've thought about this a great deal, and we are suggesting, as I think the Treasury is, carefully calibrated reforms, not upending the system, holus bolus, but we're saying that, for example, a collective bargaining system where 5 of us get around the table representing the employer and employees, unionized employees in that sector, and we do a deal. We compromise and we find a deal on wages, on standards, on leave, on whatever. That's fine. The problem is when that deal is extended to all those people who are not around the table. Who are they? Well, they're the unemployed who would work at a lesser wage or lesser standard. They're small firms who are not sitting around the table. They're firms in towns and smaller cities. They're new firms. So we've kind of locked up the system for the insiders, and we're saying, open it out so that we have more chance. We've got to incentivize employers to want to hire people, to not immediately think of all the hassle of managing people and what do you do when they don't work out, and the cost and the time and the CCMA and so on. So that's just one reform that we're talking about. We're also talking about another reform. We're saying, let us experiment, like many countries have done in Asia, China, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Cambodia, lots of places. They've experimented with low-skill manufacturing as a first step to absorbing millions of people in their first job. South Africa says, no, we don't want that. The wages are too low, not for us. And that's why I would stress, and that's where I started, you have to say to yourself, in a country when 60% of people of the workforce are not working, where do I stand? Is it better for somebody to get a toe into the labor force in a low skill, low wage job? Or is it better to be unemployed? I think the world experience is very clear. And, getting a job, you're a person who comes from a community where nobody works, where your parents haven't got jobs, you don't know much about the workforce. If you can just get into a job to make a T-shirt, you will learn on that job. It's called Knowhow. You'll learn about how the world of work, you'll are the person above you on the ladder and you'll scheme night and day on how do I get that job? How do I make a men's shirt? How do I manage other people? You get more money if you manage. Well, how do I manage? But if you're not part of that ladder, you're outside, you're learning nothing. You're not part of anything. So I'm absolutely convinced South Africa has to open the door to low skill, yes, and low wage initially jobs to try and get into export markets with basic clothing, basic assembly of electronic goods and toys and other things. And at this time of disruption caused by COVID, we might just have a chance. So we have a proposal on the table to do that. The ANC recovery strategy actually talked about something similar. They said we must open the door for low-end manufacturing. Hopefully they were talking about what we were talking about, but this is not in the plan. So we could go on and on about labor issues. Yes. Samu Keliso, I hope I've pronounced it right, has raised a very important issue. Lots of people want to talk about 4IR, and the question is really, can we talk about 4IR and low-end manufacturing at the same time in a country like South Africa? Stop and think for a moment. In South Africa, the majority of young people in our schools cannot read for meaning. We come last on almost every single comparative table in terms of reading and numeracy in our schools. And much poorer countries are doing much better than us. We have an expensive, low performance education system. So I'm really interested in getting as many people, millions of learners in our schools to read and write and get the basics. I'm a lot less focused on 4IR. I think, yes, it's coming. Yes, the top end of our economy is going to be affected by this. Yes, perhaps in time manufacturing will, but not yet. I think we need to get this into perspective. The biggest challenge for South Africa is to move away from a situation where more than 50% of our population live in poverty and more than, well, now closer to 60% of those who want to work are unemployed. That is the key fault line that creates massive inequality. That's what we've got to focus on, getting all those people into the modern economy and getting access to opportunities to improve themselves. The top end of our society are going to get into computers and all sorts of things on their own. So yes, is it real? Let me end this with asking you a big question, which I'm not going to answer today, but South Africa has a big subsidy. The biggest subsidy that we have for industry is to the automotive industry. And if you read the global trends, this is the industry that is going to have robots instead of workers faster than any other industry. And then you say to yourself, gee, is this the right approach for South Africa for the future when we have so many low-skilled people who need jobs? Let me end there. There are lots of questions. Hold on, let me see. Okay, well, they can't read them all. There are two questions that open the door I was hoping you'd open, which is, these two questions are saying they agree with my perspective on the government's plan. And they're asking, what's an alternative plan? What could it look like? I've started building this, but it's obviously hard. Let me give you a feel. So just work in progress. Here is a, for instance, call me a naive, but what I would have hoped a great day would have been if the president had stood up in Parliament 10 days ago and said something like the following. Firstly, I think you've all seen in the way that some parts of our pandemic response has been handled, how weak and corrupt the state is. And I am determined to deal with this. So I'm going to do the following things. I am going to shuffle my cabinet. I'm going to get rid of some ministers. You can put it politely, but I'm getting rid of some people. I'm also getting rid of some DGs. So there are consequences for lack of action or lack of implementation. First thing then, reshuffle cabinet and DGs. Secondly, I will have one body, the National Recovery Team, which will consist of key ministers and some business leaders, both small and big business, and perhaps one or two from civil society. But I will have a national team to manage us out of this extraordinary circumstance. And then I commit to you today that I'm going to rebuild the state. And in order to do that, we need to be clear on the principles. There's going to be a professional merit-based state, which in 2012, the NDP said we need to build. I commit to do that. There will be an exam for senior positions. The Indian civil service has it. A number of other countries have it. It's some way of getting away from patronage to getting people fit for purpose. So I'm going to appoint people in senior positions who actually want to do the job, who understand the notion of service, and who have the competence and experience. So that would be one approach that would get everyone sitting up straight. The second thing is I would say South Africa's capacity to grow and to create jobs and drive recovery. We need growth in order to deal with the fiscal crisis, and we need growth for jobs and the creation of wealth and to pay taxes and all the things we know. The only way to do that is to free up the private sector. And I'm going to do this in the next 2 months. I'm appointing Mr. X and somebody else. They're going to look at what laws and regulations increase the cost of doing business. And they will give me a report in 2 months. And in 3 months, I promise to implement it. That's it. We're going to free it up. We're going to introduce all sorts of innovations in terms of red tape. Some countries have I forget what it's called, but it's, in terms of certain regulations, if you don't get a reply from the bureaucracy within a month, just do it. You're right, they didn't reply, do it. So obviously you need certain basic standards of health and safety, but otherwise just go for it. I also, the mining sector, let me just take that example. Business mobilized phenomenally in response to COVID, and we haven't found any other business sector that has done anything equivalent to our business sector. They donated enormous amounts of money, billions of money. They got together, they pulled people together, all as volunteers, to help identify where could South Africa get PPE equipment. And using their global supply chains, they managed to get the PPE equipment that South Africa needed very quickly, often paying for a lot of it. So business mobilized phenomenally. And one of the things they did was they got a whole lot of people from every sector to sit down and say, this is what we need fixed in order to grow. And the one I know best, I think it's one of the best documents, comes from the mining sector. It's on our website if anyone is interested. And it's a very thoughtful document on what is needed to get South Africa's mining sector back to its world-class status. Why couldn't the president just have said, I'm doing that. You've done all the work. I've heard it. I'm doing it. I will implement it with the miners in the next few months. So I think that's the second set of things he could have announced. Then the the last I've already talked about, I would have expanded public works programs. I think you have to, as much as we can afford. But I would do it at the public works wage, not the national minimum wage. And then in addition, I would have made reforms to labor laws, and I would have gone for this experiment in Nelson Mandela Bay, where we have a sunk investment in Kucha, an underutilized port. We could get this going very quickly. And I would have said to the private sector, work with the DTIC and do it. Make it happen. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't work, we don't need subsidies. We don't need lots of money. Too bad. But maybe South Africa can get into global supply chains now with low skill jobs. So that just gives you some of the things I've been thinking about. Obviously, very big issue that I would have announced is a very different dispensation for the large state-owned companies. One of the, not only do they cost us enormous money, I would not fund SAA, by the way, but we need to think about each one of the big companies. What's viable? How do we do it? What must be privatized? What must be closed? The key issue here is South Africa spends so much time focusing on SAA in the middle of the worst aviation crisis probably of a century. What we don't do is we don't talk about the aviation industry. That's what we should be talking about. What aviation industry does South Africa need? How do we think about that? What transport industry does South Africa need? How do we think about that? How do we manage the inner city rail system that has unbelievably been vandalized and collapsed? What could be more important than that? So we go on and on about funding SAA or this or that failing state-owned enterprise when quite clearly we're not able to manage them. They've been disasters. They drain the fiscus. They don't provide the services the economy needs at the price we need, but we don't focus on the right thing. So I would have said something profound on state-owned enterprises. Let me stop there and see if there are other, this is difficult to do. Let me, somebody's asking about the cities. I'm going to sort of use that as an opportunity. They're saying, you know, what's happening with the cities? Do we focus enough attention? What about the mayors and so on? I'm absolutely convinced that South Africa's cities are one of our advantages as a developing country, and that we need much more attention paid to how we support those big cities, how we get them financially viable, and how we make them places of expanding opportunity, much more enterprise and hope for poorer people. So I think that as a society, we tend to ignore the fact that we're nearly 70% urbanized and that the vast majority of our economic activity takes place in our larger cities. And this trend is only increasing. We shouldn't ignore rural development, but South Africa's never had an effective rural development strategy. We do terrible things in the past to rural people, and we should have a rural strategy. But we stand or fall as a country by our cities, and can we make them viable financially and competitive places in which to live and absorption places for the poor? This is a very big topic, so more attention should be paid to this. I personally am interested in the idea of the direct election of mayors. I think it would rejuvenate city management and be very different environment from where we are now. It should be the second most important At the moment, South Africans think about national government, the cabinet, then provincial government, the premiers and the legislature, and then we come to local government and metros. This is crazy. Obviously, key portfolios in national government are very important, some of them. But then the next most important, in my view, is how you run Johannesburg, how you run Cape Town. Who is it? What is the quality of people we're attracting? What are the skills they have? What's the team around them? How do we modernize urban government? There are all sorts of innovations taking place in terms of technology and other things to increase service delivery. And South Africa is not at the cutting edge here at all. So local government around the country has collapsed for a whole lot of reasons, a terrible situation. But I think we need a lot more attention to making our metro governments fit for purpose. And we need some debate on how best to do that. We need to modernize and evolve, and both politics and structures and so on. So thank you for that very important question. It's an issue close to our heart. There's a document on our website if you want to look at that. How much more time do we have? We have about 2 more minutes. I see some people disagree with me, or one person on SAA. That's a big debate. Let me take maybe this issue. That's an important issue. The question is about the civil service, and how do we build an effective civil service? And one thing I neglected to talk about is, at the moment we do not have a strong and clear dividing line between the political party and the state. These are very different entities. The state are institutions with people that we pay for from public taxes, whose job it is to promote the national interest, the public interest. Political parties in a democracy have a very different role. They need to compete with each other. They need to fight elections and get elected. But South Africans are not clear about the difference between the state and the party. And I think that is one of our deep problems, that we think the state is there to give jobs to pals. The state is there to compensate you for not having had a job before. This is crazy. We have to, as much as possible, think about how we get a professional administration. There were some good ideas in the National Development Plan, and I think there are some good ideas we can take from other countries on how to do this, but we have to take this seriously, and we have to decide where to start and how to actually make this happen. So I am very much in favor. I'm not a libertarian. There are people who think you need a smaller and smaller state. I am not in that school of thought. Developing countries need a capable, effective state. I don't like to use the word strong state, because in this era of increasing authoritarianism, we don't want to promote that. I want a capable state that can do the basic job we need of a state, that understands how to regulate competitive markets so that public processes are not taken to the cleaners by shysters in the private sector. So we desperately need a really world-class police service. We need to fix our education system. As I said earlier, very expensive, comparatively expensive. We spend proportionately at the higher end of most countries on basic education. We get very low quality, low value for money in almost every area, health and so on and so forth. So I think the key is the state is absolutely vital, the local state absolutely vital, and we need to think afresh on how we're going to build a capable state. But we also need to think a lot harder on what we do in between, from here to there. I think Heather wants to depose me and make some closing remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heather Bangwayo, the Senior Liaison Officer in the Alumni Relations Office. I'd like to start off by giving a very big thank you to Ann for today's webinar. I'm sure we've all been affected by COVID-19 in one way or another, whether it's salary cuts, loss of business, loss of a breadwinner. I mean, the list goes on. But difficult as it may be, I think we've got to start picking up the pieces, whether it's as individuals, as families, and certainly as a nation. I will say that this is not a conversation that's been sparked by the current pandemic. These are conversations that we've been having, or at least should have been having for a while now. I hope that today's event has ignited something in each of you to take this conversation forward and to start to formulate ideas and ventures to bring it all to life. Anne has given us so much to think about, and I'm confident that you will find it all very valuable. Something that really struck me as Anne was speaking just now was in the very beginning when she said that we tend to compensate impoverished communities. I think that's what you said, Anne, rather than remunerate them for their inclusion. And I think this is something that I personally will take forward, and personally in my own space start to think about how I can, start to influence that, it would turn that around. One of our goals here in the Alumni Office is to always provide you with information and resources that are useful for your continued development and learning. And today, we hope that we have not only been able to do that, but we've given you something to start thinking about the development and growth of just even in your own communities and as a nation, as we collectively begin to restore our economy. I think as citizens, we have the responsibility to ourselves and certainly to coming generations to play our parts, big or small, in contributing to a strong and healthy economy wherever we can, wherever and whenever we can. I'd also like to thank Lebogang Montjane, who is a member of the EXCO of Convocation, for graciously affording us his time and joining us in today's event. We really appreciate that. Lastly, but definitely not least, I'd like to thank everyone who made it to today's webinar from all over the world. We're so grateful for this unexpected but very welcome consequence of having been forced to conduct what we normally would have done physically on campus. We've now had to turn those into virtual online sessions. And what's happened as a result of that is that we've been able to have more people join us, people who might be across the world in different countries, in different provinces even, who might not have been able to make it to these events. We look forward to seeing you next month for our final webinar for the year. Until then, thank you very much and good afternoon.